William Meader.
Hello. Yes, it's lovely to be here. And it's, as she said, I was actually raised here, just at Girard and 24th until 1977 when I went to the West Coast. So it feels like I'm coming back to the nest in a way. It's lovely. So yes, thank you for coming. And my topic today is called The Soul and Its Creative Destiny. And what I would like to do is to give you an understanding of how the esoteric philosophy views your soul as an agency of making a contribution to a better world. You see, it's long been understood in this philosophy that the soul itself is governed by several laws, several fundamental principles. And one of those principles or laws is called the law of service. Every human soul, in its evolutionary journey, is seeking to work through a personality, work through a lower self. And it wants to work through that personality. It wants that personality to get out of the way. By the way, that's the challenge. And in so doing, it wants to make an uplifting contribution to something beyond itself. And so service is a fundamental pattern woven into the consciousness of soul. And so this is what I kind of want to talk to you about today. And when we talk about the path itself and a readiness for soulful service, there's a major step that is believed to take place in one's incarnational journey, and we call it the awakening. It's a period of time in your evolution where for the first time you inwardly wake up to your own duality. That is to say, you inwardly discover that there's a higher dimension to yourself. You recognize your day-to-day consciousness. That's clear, but you also sense a higher prompting, a kind of intuitive recognition of a deeper truth. You also recognize or wake up to a kind of higher love, a love that is less focused on the personal and more the impersonal, a kind of love of the one, the love of humanity. And you start to realize that that part of you that you're starting to sense, you're actually waking up to the soul itself. And increasingly, over time, an individual will begin to put more energy and more focus into trying to understand how to live from that place more, how to lift your consciousness to that higher, subtler perch, which is where that sense of wisdom and deeper love is felt. And it's when that awakening has occurred and afterwards that we start to recognize what the personality is really about, the lower self. We start to realize very slowly that the destiny of the personality is to be the outer servant on behalf of the soul itself. The destiny of the personality is to be the garment through which the soul expresses itself. And that personality has three components to it. It has a mental component, an emotional component, and a physical component. And we often talk about the personality as the threefold personality, mental, emotional, and physical. And that the soul itself, which is the storehouse of that higher love and wisdom, it wants to utilize that personality in its three parts as tools, as instruments to make a difference out there. And in the big picture, that's all the personality is. Its destiny is to simply be the vehicle and the instrumentation used by the soul in order to touch humanity through the power of thought, in order to feel with humanity through the power of the feeling dimension of the personality, and the capacity to use a physical instrument in order to do, to act, to serve, to make something practical and real and uplifting. So that soul in you and that soul in me needs that threefold personality in order to achieve what it needs to achieve. And there's an ancient science that speaks of how that works, how the soul does utilize the mental vehicle of the personality. How does it engage in the feeling dimension of the personality? How does it impulse action on a physical level? There's an ancient science to that. Sometimes it's called the science of magic, but it's really the science of creative expression. So today I want to kind of give you some idea of how that works. First, I want you to know that in this philosophy, it's understood that the soul itself is in meditation throughout the duration of your incarnation. And we're given to understand that the soul, when it meditates, it can meditate in 3 different directions. On its own level, and it is said that the soul, which is also called your causal body, the container deep within that is holding your soul's consciousness, that soul at times will develop meditative rapport. You might say outwardly. It develops meditative rapport with the larger group that it is karmically associated with. Sometimes the soul is actually meditating upward, and in that case, it's reconnecting itself with the greater life that it's a cell within. But sometimes the soul is meditating downwards, toward the personality. And that's what we call the downward gazing soul. The downward gazing soul. And those are the moments of magical opportunity, when the soul is downward gazing and is trying to influence that personality in a profound way. Maybe some of you have had that experience where, have you ever had where you're meditating, you have a deep meditation, you feel aligned, you feel like you're right on the beam, and then later on it seems to fade away a bit, and you don't feel as connected. Well, there's actually many interesting reasons for that, but one of them is, while you were meditating, the soul was downward gazing, but later on it turned its gaze in another direction. But when and as you evolve further in your consciousness, slowly the soul begins to gaze in all 3 directions at the same time. But when the soul is downward gazing, what it does is, I'm going to use a kind of an esoteric language here, but it is said that when the soul downward gazes, it is actually trying to project an intuitive seed within your mind. And yet it requires that the lower self, the 3 parts of the personality, upward yearn. You see, it's not just about, oh, let's hope my personality can register something. It's actually the personality itself, in its full 3-fold nature, must be saying yes and being wanting and aligning inwardly. And so when you have a downward gazing soul occurring, at the same time you have an upward yearning personality, those are the moments of magical opportunity. And we're told that at those moments, something called the point of light emerges within the fabric or the depth of consciousness. The point of light. And that point of light is not literally a light, that's a metaphor. The point of light is a term used to describe the germ, the intuitive germ of a thought to be. The germ of a thought to be. It's the seed that will become a thought. And in that moment, that seed is planted, the mind begins to try to coordinate a thought form to represent that seed. And so there's this understanding that thoughts are assemblages that are inspired by formless intuition, that seed. And when that first thought form occurs, that's when you have an idea, that's when you have a deep spiritual insight, that's when you say, I just had a great spiritual idea. Thoughts are understood in this philosophy as being an assembly of mental substance that creates thought forms, and that it's living in its own right. And that when you have that thought, the key is to be able to not only have that thought, but keep yourself detached from it. Because one of the challenges in the creative process from a spiritual perspective is that we have those moments where we have those intuitive insights, but sometimes the self, the personality particularly, will want to jump in and possess it and say, it's my thought. But in fact, it's not your thought. It's never been your thought. You're being the instrument of something beyond. And that we want to remain the observer at the same time that we're having our thoughts. That's the great challenge on the path, you know. It's always that process of having a realization and still being able to observe yourself having the realization. One of the most important principles in the creative process is a great phrase. A master once said this, and it applies to the whole process. The process of the mental dimension of creativity, the emotional dimension, and the physical. And here's the phrase. Always remember that you are the director on the stool. Never leave the stool to become one of the characters on the stage. See, do you understand? You are the director. You are the beingness behind the process of thinking. You are the presence that gives rise to the feeling component of life. And you are the eternal essence behind your physical expressions. But the great challenge for us is that as the director on the stool, we have something happen and we jump onto the stage. Now, what's the stage? The stage is the character called thoughts. The character is called feelings. And so oftentimes we have an insightful thought and then we allow ourselves to become the thought. And that's where the challenge is. Become the thought. And we don't want to become the thought. You're the creator and the thought is that which you have created. And so there's always this sense of always remembering to be separate from it. Because once you start to jump into that feeling and into that thought, the self, it is an energy system in its own right, and it will tend to distort that thought form that has come forth through you. In Hinduism, there's a term called Ahamkara. Don't know if you know what that is, Ahamkara. Ahamkara is, a simple definition is, it's the principle of it's the tendency to self-reference. And the moment you, as the creator, identify yourself with your thought form, it's a sure bet that we have the beginnings of some measure of distortion. You following me? Everybody tracking this okay? So, once we have our thought form, the first levels of that is normally considered abstract. Abstract. I love what Kyle Gibran in The Prophet says about this. He says, vague and nebulous is the beginning of all things, but not their end. But we have to build more texture to our idea. You have a good foundational idea, but now you want to build further thoughts around it to give it richness, to give it texture, and to give it deeper understanding of how to make it actually work in the outer world. But there comes a time when we have to begin to bring it into the emotional field, the emotional body. Now, what's the function of emotion as it pertains to the creative process? The emotions, when rightly managed in this creative process, do two things. Number one, your emotions create what has been called the power of magnetic appeal. The power of magnetic appeal. You want your new idea to have a radiatory magnetic quality to it. You want to use your emotional body as an agency of the law of attraction. The second function is that emotions, when rightly managed and integrated into your new thought form, they have the power to provide vitality, a push power. You know yourself, you're much more likely to manifest a good idea if you have some sort of emotional conviction associated with it, rather than just the idea on its own without that conviction. But that in itself is important, because it's about how to watch your emotions and understand your instrument so well that you understand what constitutes the right amount of feeling to give it. Because when you have too much emotion imbued into your new thought form and you get so excited about it, you're going to have an added sense of distortion, and you can have a tendency to make a mountain out of a molehill. You know what I mean? It's happened to me many times. And yet if you don't have enough, then it doesn't have that oomph power. It doesn't have the push power to continue the creative process for the externalization of what it is you're trying to bring forward. So skill in the magical work of creativity has to do with recognizing the nature of your emotional body, recognizing what constitutes the right amount of feeling to give it. By the way, that's a tall order. I mean, think about it. When you have a good idea, you know, the emotions can kind of capture it for a while and they take over for a while. But you know, that would never happen to a master. Heavens no. A master would never would be so masterful at using the instruments that would intuitively sense how much feeling to give it. There's a kind of science to this, as you might be able to surmise by what I'm saying here. It's to really study the instruments. And each person has a different makeup in their emotional nature and mental nature. But to study it, know when it becomes overdone, know when it needs to be amplified. It's a whole science. And the other thing about the emotions as you're adding it to your creative thought form is that you want to be sure that when you add that emotion to it, that you want your emotional nature at that moment to be in a certain condition of readiness. Like for instance, let's use it this way. Let's say that you're emotionally kind of down right now, or depressed, or even angry. That's probably not the best time to start adding emotion to your new and creative idea. Probably not. And at the same time, or if you're particularly elated and happy, actually that's not the time either. Because it is said in the ancient literature that when you have strong emotions that are positive or negative, it means that the water of the emotions is still rippling. And so any kind of agitation in your emotional nature is actually going to have a compromising effect on if you bring that water into your thought form at that moment. What the ideal situation is, as given to us by the masters of old, is to bring emotion into your thought form when your emotional body is limpid like a pond of stillness and calm. Because then you won't have the tendency to over-exaggerate the thought form you're creating. And by having your emotional body calm, your emotional body actually is water, and it has a natural tendency to reflect intuition. But if the waters are rippling, the reflection is lost. Still with me? So, one of the things that you need to understand when we think about this process from an emotional point of view is that you want to, there's always a challenge. This is probably one of the most challenging phases of the creative process, the process of adding feeling to your thought. Because when we think about the four elements, there's an inherent challenge right there. You see, what happens is thought is fire, the fire of a new idea. And you're bringing fire into water. And when you put fire and water together, you get steam. And steam obscures vision. So many, many people, when they are spiritually creative, they bring the water in without enough thought of how to do this wisely. And it creates steam, which creates uncertainty of where am I really supposed to take it next. It is said in this ancient literature that when you start to add that water to your thought form, pause, don't jump. Hold the feeling, but don't act on it. Allow the potential of the steam to settle. It's like fog. Allow the ground fog to settle before you move forward in that next step. Many, many people, and I'm guilty of this too, jumped too quickly, got too excited, brought too much feeling into it, and that feeling created a heightened impulse to act. It's hard to have a good feeling about a thought and imbuing it with a sense of warmth and magneticness and not to act on it right away. But that also shows that when you're able to do that, that shows mastery of the emotional body. And that's what we want to do. We want to use the emotional body and not be used by the emotional body. That's an important concept. Use the emotional body, do not be used by it. Now, one of the things that is so important in this creative process that it should be, is sort of always in the game, is that the use of the third eye is absolutely central to this work. And your third eye is such an interesting subject. I could spend hours sharing with you some ideas about it, but in this context, let me give you a couple understandings of what is the third eye and how would we even know it's open, really. We talk about the third eye a lot, but how do we know what it is and would we recognize it? And often we think about the third eye in as a receptor of intuition, and that's true. This third eye has both a horizontal quality of perception to it as well as a vertical. But often we think about it from a vertical perspective. We talk about the third eye as the gateway through which spiritual intuition can be registered within you. And of course that's absolutely true. But what we sometimes do not think about, and yet it's so important to think about it in the creative process, is how it horizontally relates to life. Because when your third eye is functioning, it does a couple major things. One of the most important is that the third eye is the part of your perceptual mechanism that makes it possible for you to see the soul hidden in all things. To see the soul hidden in all things. You know, when you, for instance, it's really becomes evident in nature. You know, walk through a beautiful garden or a forest. When you look at a beautiful tree, these two eyes, which are called the eyes that look from here to there, these two eyes see the form, see the characteristics. But the third eye is the part of you that shifts its focus away from the detail of the form to start to sense something deeper. You start to sense the living principle, the life nature of the tree. You start to sense that life force as it works its way up through the trunk, the branches, and the leaves. You're starting to sense the soul of the tree. And that instrument is crucial to creative work on behalf of the soul. Because whatever your service is, it's actually the soul of the thing you're serving that should be the focus. But taking it a little bit further, your third eye is also that part of you that not only sees the soul in a tree and starts to sense the soul in another person, but the more the third eye opens and becomes utilized, the more you see it operating in larger living systems. For instance, you start to look at the world events, and you start to see that there's something soulful underlying. You start to look at crisis in the Middle East, for instance, and the BBC or CNN provides you information that supports these two eyes. But deeper than that, you start to sense sacred principles struggling to express themselves through form. In this case, form is the social event itself, and doing it with varying degrees of accuracy and distortion. Even you know, in this philosophy it is said that there are 7 types of souls. 7 types of souls. It's a whole nother talk, but essentially 7 types of souls, and each will be attracted to serving humanity in broadly different categories. Sometimes it's called the 7 rays. Anybody familiar with the 7 rays notion? Okay. Well, the 7 rays not only applies to your soul nature, but it also applies to larger living systems. So I'll use an example. A 3rd ray soul is somebody that it tends to be, who's on the path and awake to that 3rd ray, will want to use their creative tendencies and apply it often within the context of business and economics. And that would be a person that would be highly evolved on a 3rd ray line and would want to creatively manifest forms that support the upliftment of the business world, but if it's really from the soul, it will be an urge to support business as it tries to support right distribution of resources to ensure the sustenance of all life on this planet. So, a 3rd ray soul, that person's 3rd eye would tend to look out, would be attracted to, would be compelled and naturally gravitate to fields of service that are underlying economic issues. And that person would start to sense the soul of business, because a business is an entity too. And it has a soul, and it has a personality, and it's struggling to transform its lower nature in support of its higher nature, just like you and me. A 1st ray soul is going to work through government, a 2nd ray soul, education and the healing arts. What I guess I'm trying to say here is that the use of your 3rd eye will be largely defined by the type of soul you are, and your capacity to see the soul in the outer world is very much related to that same ray tendency. Now, so that's one of the key functions of the 3rd eye in magic, is to see the soul in the thing you are inclined to serve, whether it's business, whether it's the arts, whether it's science, whether it's education, whether it's the healing arts, whether it's religion. All of those are what we call the departments. Those are simply departments of evolution. Every social system is just a category of human consciousness evolving over the vastness of time. Each has a higher nature, each has a lower nature. And if you're drawn to that, it's your 3rd eye that helps you sense intuitively, what is the soul of this thing I am seeking to serve? That's who you're serving. The other thing is this: in the magical creative process, your 3rd eye is also a directing agency outwardly, a directing agency. Let me share with you something. You know that there's a very famous phrase that's been around for years that alternative thinkers and metaphysicians use all the time. You've heard the phrase. The phrase is, energy follows thought, right? You've heard this, right? Energy follows thought. Did you know that that actually is a truncated, and that the last half of that sentence got dropped away? That's only the first half of the sentence. Let me give you the whole sentence. Energy follows thought, and the eye directs the energy. And the eye directs the energy. Wow, what a thing to drop. Your capacity to utilize your 3rd eye in the creative process is also the very thing that helps you know and sense what's the next step. How do I move it forward correctly? By the way, your 3rd eye is not fully opened until just before stepping into full enlightenment. For you and I, it's a squinting 3rd eye. But you know, I always think that a squinting 3rd eye is better than none at all. So taking that in mind, the 3rd eye is really important in the whole process, So let's now shift it a bit and talk about it from the actual next step, which is the physical bringing it forward, the physical bringing it forward. So much of it has to do with the principle of right timing. And how do we understand the timing aspects of things? I don't know about you, but there's been times when, you know, I've had a great idea, I've wanted to bring it forward, but I didn't sense the timing right, and, you know, it died right away. It didn't work, you know. In fact, it's interesting because spiritual timing in magic has nothing to do with calendars and watches. It's actually having to do with what is called etheric timing. Etheric timing. Now, the term etheric in the esoteric philosophy is in reference to your chakra system. Your chakras are part of what is called the etheric body, which is it's the vital nature of your physical body. And as you know, you've got 7 major chakras, you've got 49 subsidiary chakras, and beyond that, and that there's all these energetic lines called lines of nadis. That etheric body is one of the most important tools to use in your creative work, particularly when it comes to timing. And because if you're not thinking about the delivery of something from that kind of deeper timing perspective, you can have what is called in ancient esotericism the process of creating a stillborn child. You delivered something and it died at the moment of its birth. So etheric timing is this. If you look at your own etheric body, it's your vital body. It's the thing that gives you vitality. And you monitor it throughout your day. You find that sometimes you're vital and sometimes you're depleted. And some people call it biorhythms. You've heard the term biorhythms. Well, studying your own biorhythms is very important. Getting a sense of where are you in the cycle of your biorhythmic wave pattern is important. And that's half of the equation, though. There's your biorhythms and what is the right timing within that cycle. And then there's also the biorhythms pertaining to the field right here, this field. Because in this room right now, there's an etheric field. And that field is actually crucial to understanding creativity. In fact, right now, you and I are and you among yourselves as well as with me, we are building an etheric web in this field. In this field. Let me give you a quick example just to highlight it. How to understand this. Amy, I got to tell you, it was so lovely to have you still awake when I arrived late last night, and I want to thank you for that. How did you feel? Were you okay staying up so late to wait for me to arrive? She did just fine. Thank you. Did you see it? Did you see what just happened? What happened is this. When I spoke words to Amy, it's not just words. Words occultly have etheric substance, etheric vitality associated with them. And when I project words to Amy, a thread of vital substance follows that. And her response was to create a thread back to me. And right now, at this moment, though I can't see that thread, at this moment I can feel it, because right now I can feel a measure of intimacy with Amy because of that thread. That's happening all the time, every conversation you've had. There's a whole observational process of sensing that etheric field. And it too ebbs and flows. It too has a high point and a low point. And when you're trying to utilize your third eye, part of it is to gauge the condition of the field. The condition of the field. Now, you might think that the time for you to deliver something, well, one time it's not good, is if I'm in my low cycle, so I'm depleted. Or if the field is in its low cycle, that's not the best time to deliver the thing that is your main gift. It's not the time. And yet, you know, the opposite, if for instance, I'm very vital, it's charged up, and the field is charged up, that's not the time either. That's not the time either. Because either way, there's a disadvantage to that. You see, when the field is depleted, if you're going to bring something forward, your gift, your wisdom, the peace that you want to give, when that happens, it just goes through people. Because they're actually becoming internalized in a certain sense. And yet, if the field is charged, and you're going to send your message, your gift out there, what happens is you send it out there and the field takes it in and goes, got it, what's next? Got it, what's next? So the problem is this, in the first case, nothing happens, it just goes through you. In the second case, there's registration but not integration. So there's a whole consideration that needs to come into play around that process, you see. Another interesting thing to keep in mind in the creative process when you're delivering your new idea is something called the ancient fires. The ancient fires. You know, this is a subject that I do coursework on, and it's a 2-year training for people. And so I'm giving you some essential ideas, but there's a lot of deeper technique involved. But one of the things that to keep in mind that I think you will all relate to is that, how do I want to word this? In the study of the magical process in its fullness, and I've skipped many steps here, but one of the steps, there's a phase in it where you recognize how the larger living system, the angelic Davic intelligences, how you conspire to cooperate with that, and how circumstances are shaped in support of your creative effort. And that when you really understand how to facilitate that process, then things work out. You know, people cross your path at exactly the right time. The phone rings exactly when you were needing to speak to that person, and that's not coincidence. There's a physics behind that. There's an actual philosophic explanation of why and how that happens. I can't get into that in this short talk. But I wanted you to know that there's that beauty, that there's processes that support you, intelligences that support you beyond just you. You're not in it alone. Larger agencies can shape circumstance in support of what you're doing, depending upon if you can hold your consciousness in the correct way. But having said that, there's other times when you have to deal with the enemy. The look on that man's face was fantastic. He went, "Thank you, sir." The enemy. But you got to understand, the enemy is never people. Enemy is never people. What is the enemy? The enemy is archaic ideations. The enemy to the future is the ideas of the past. In many ways, humanity's evolution is its evolution through ideations. We have great ideas throughout history. We have great ideas. They integrate into culture, into civilization, into social systems, and those are great. They have uplifting value, and they enrich us. But every idea, in time, will have run its course and will have given of itself all it can. And then if continually holding it, it becomes increasingly an obstacle. When I work with students, new students in various countries, I often tell people, I say, look, here's a phrase to keep in mind. That which is your temple today will become your prison tomorrow. The ideas that you hold as near and dear and true to you for spiritual reasons or otherwise, as long as they enrich you, widen you, make you understand life and yourself better, fantastic. But every ideal will run its course. Every temple becomes a prison. And the problem is to recognize when it's a prison. And the irony of that whole thing is that not only does the temple become a prison, but you become the prisoner and not know it. Instead, you put yourself in the position of the warden and the guard. It's a strange thing. We are the prisoner, we are the warden, and we are the guard. All of humanity's issues the struggles even today, because there's huge, I don't know if you've noticed, there's huge things going on, but largely in the biggest picture, it's a story about the conflict between new and emerging ideas and the resisting forces of old ideas that are putting up a fight. And they're strong. In ancient esotericism, they have a name. They're called the ancient fires. And they are lethal. They are strong and they are lethal. Why? Because they have the historical advantage. They've been around a long time. And if you're really doing spiritual work, really bringing the best of you forward, your ideas should be progressive. Every disciple, every really spiritual-oriented person should be on some level a pioneer. Advocating new and progressive ideas that have the power to uplift something beyond yourself. And many times you get the right people at the right time and all of that's good, but there are times when you will meet the enemy because you will, it'll come to you. And by the way, even in myself, I do a lot of speaking, and occasionally I'll be in a group of people where, the ancient fires are out there. They're out there. And you have to be intuitively sensitive to it. And you have to be intuitively recognized, what are those ancient fires and what can I do to transform them? What can I do to transform them? And by the way, they're often hidden behind smiling faces. It's just a side note. Okay. Because I've seen many a spiritual person walk into a field, into a circumstance, and didn't realize the ancient fires were laying in wait. And they got incinerated, decimated, crawling out, never to try again. So this question of the ancient fires has to be dealt with when you're working in magic, when you're working with soul creativity, because you will run into it. Maybe some of you have. Some of you are going like this right now. You know about this. It's the power of the status quo that often is the root of this issue. And some ancient fire is really ancient, like what you're seeing in the Middle East on a collective level in the Middle East, and the rise of militant Islam, as well as the rise of fundamentalist born-again Christians. Both of those patterns are just manifestations of intensity of ancient fire. So this concept of ancient fire is not just isolated to an individual, it's found within society itself, because you have to, every principle I speak to you about in terms of your internal consciousness has a reflection in the collective of humanity as well, or in a nation. But dealing with it is interesting, because one of the ways to understand how to deal with the ancient fire is to remember this one thing. At one time, ancient fire was actually cutting-edge fire, what we call solar fire. At one time, ancient fire was solar fire. At one time, that old idea that seems so archaic, at one time it was cutting edge. If you don't remember that, you haven't a prayer to deal with it correctly. And in this philosophy, it's understood that thought forms, whether modern, new, progressive, or ancient, are actually entities. A thought form isn't just a random thing. It has a livingness to it. It has a soul, and it has a personality. The personality of a thought form is the idea itself. The soul of a thought form is the spiritual principles at its core. That's its soul. And the way you deal with the ancient fires is to recognize the duality of the thought form that is oppositional to you and is resisting. What I'm saying is, that old idea, you have to see beyond the oldness of the idea itself to sense what is the sacred principle behind that idea, because once you sense that, then you can begin to realize that the form that it is manifesting as is obviously the problem and not the essence. I'll give you an example right now, just as a large-scale thing. Always Adolf Hitler is a great example. Okay. Nazism. What is it? That's a collection of thought forms. A collection of thought forms. But those thought forms, as despicable as they are, at the core of some of those thought forms is a set of sacred principles. For instance, in the case of Hitler, one of the principles, sacred principles that he was engaged with is what we call the principle of purification. Now, the principle of purification in esotericism is as sacred as the principle of love, But the form that note of that soul of purification took, Nazism, became the purification of racial type, which is a great distortion. But the essence behind it is absolutely sacred. Sacred, pure. You and I, as spiritual people, we should recognize the principle of purification in the fabric of our lives. You and I should be purifying our lives so that more of the best of us can come forward. It's the same principle, but in his case, distorted in despicable form. So if you want to deal with it, you have to be able to see through the form to sense what is the sacred principle or principles. Sometimes there's more than one. And what's interesting about that is that that's another function of the third eye. Remember, this third eye is helping you see the soul hidden in all things. One of those things is thought forms. Can I sense the soul within a thought form? And the way you do that is that, in fact, this is true with any function of the third eye, is if you really want to engage the third eye, the first thing you have to do is, number one, suspend judgment. Rapid judgment is said to be the force that immediately closes the third eye. And number two, look with soft eyes. Look with soft eyes. And recognize that sacred principle or principles, whatever it is, and in your own way, with your language, with your influence, with your presence, lift it in honor with one hand, symbolically. And then at the same time, with your other hand, symbolically, try to show a reshaping of the form so that that sacred principle can have a new container that's more useful for the future. Because if you drop that hand, you're done. Game over. You have to sense the deeper spiritual truth. A great master once said this, and I'm going to close with this. I see I'm running out of time. Great Master said this: find the golden thread of truth within illusion. Find the golden thread of truth within illusion. That golden thread is actually sacred and eternal. The principle of purification is true in the past, the present, and the future. It's only the form that it takes that is temporal, and it becomes irrelevant over time. But the principle is eternal. Okay? I took you 5 minutes further than I was supposed to. Sorry. So I'm going to stop. Am I right on the timing on this? Okay. So thank you all for letting me speak today. Okay, everyone. Let's hold ourselves steady, and for a moment I'd like you to just take some breaths, but try to create some evenness in your breathing and find your inner center in that process. And as you breathe evenly, remember that you are a spiritual magician, and that your soul seeks to make a contribution, an uplifting contribution to a better world, and that you have instruments, tools within you that make all of that possible. It's a great blessing to know that you are a sacred being utilizing forms of personality in order to uplift and create a greater sense of betterment. And with a sense of spiritual conviction, let us together 3 times softly chant the Om together in closing. Om.